Hello, I'm David Miller. I regret to inform you that my landmark legal case against Bristol University is being appealed. My case established anti-Zionist beliefs are protected under the Equality Act 2010.
The power of the Israeli and Zionist lobbies in the West has once again come under scrutiny following the British government's recent attacks on the freedom and liberty of its own citizens.
The Zionist component of Islamophobia, and it was
Shortly after giving Deep Dive Perspective the interview which you're about to watch, Professor David Miller, a former lecturer at Bristol University, was detained by British counter-terrorism police under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act of 2000. Professor Miller was stopped by 8 police officers and held for 3.5 hours under Section 7, after being questioned about his trip to Lebanon. He was subsequently released without charge. At the time of his detention, Professor Miller was returning to Heathrow Airport from Beirut, where he'd been reporting on the funeral of the former Secretary General of the Lebanese resistance movement. This prominent figure was assassinated last year by Israel in a bombing raid that destroyed 6 residential blocks in Beirut, killing hundreds of civilians during Israel's invasion of Lebanon. In this interview, Professor Miller takes a deep dive into the relationship between Zionism, the Israeli lobby, Western powers, and their various institutions. The discussion raises critical questions. Are British institutions compromised? To what extent are Western democracies influenced or even controlled by Israel and its Zionist lobbies?
Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we try to highlight countercultural, counterpolitical narratives, and it doesn't get much more countercultural than talking about Zionism, the Jewish fraternity, and the relations of Israel with the West, because there have been allegations and in fact many evidenced videotapes that have come out showing the relationship between British parliamentarians and Israeli lobbyists. Now, of course, everybody knows there's a very strong Zionist lobby force operating not only in Britain, but in America and across Europe as a whole. And the relations between Israel and the Western powers seem to be almost unbreakable, unshakable, even in the face of what people have been calling a genocide in Palestine. Well, here in Britain in particular, it does seem as though that power, that connection between a foreign nation carrying an ideology which has some dubious aspects to it for sure, Zionism, does have an extraordinarily special relationship with people in power. And with me in the studio today is Professor David Miller, a sociologist, but also the founder of Spinwatch, an investigative journalistic outlet which basically covers detailed, deep dive perspectives and investigations on all sorts of issues, but particularly on Zionism. David Miller, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to investigate and explore this relationship, because the first thing that comes to mind is nations are sovereign, that are democratic, that are independent, have their own security interests, they have their own interests per se, economic and otherwise. So of course they have relationships with other nations, and those relationships, one would have thought, vary depending on commonality of all kinds. But the relationship of Israel particularly, let's start with Britain, but America too, keeping America in mind, knowing that Donald Trump has come into power and has a very, very strong cabinet which actually is very pro-Zionist, very pro-Israel, just as virtually every president has had in America. But in Britain, there was a bit more of a push-pull out on the surface. Jeremy Corbyn, case in point, who has very strong opinions on Palestine and the freedom and liberty of Palestinians, and had a very thorny relationship with Zionism. And in fact, many would argue that he was actually ousted from his leadership of the Labour Party because of his stance around this issue. Now, today, what we're finding is ever more openly Zionist lobby groups are exercising their influence and their power, going after individuals, heckling those who try to speak up against Israeli interests. And they label people and individuals and politicians as anti-Semitic if they so much as object to the kind of relationship that goes on. What's been your, at Spinwatch, what's been your overview of this entire phenomena of the relationship between Zionist Israel and the Western powers?
Well, I suppose it's a good idea to put this into some kind of historical context in terms of my own trajectory in relation to the issue. So I set up Spinwatch in 2004 with some colleagues, and we looked at questions of lobbying and special interests in politics, but also just in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, that we looked at propaganda, state propaganda, and manipulation, misinformation, etc. And it was in that context that we started for the first time to look at what we eventually realized was Zionism. But we weren't looking at Zionism. We didn't start off by looking at Zionism. We started off by looking at Islamophobia, the rise in Islamophobia after 9/11. And one of the things we did in the late noughties was to look at some think tanks, some of the key think tanks in the UK who were, it seemed, promoting Islamophobia. The Henry Jackson Society, the Policy Exchange, the Centre for Social Cohesion, which later merged into the Henry Jackson Society. And we looked at them and we asked why they were pushing Islamophobia, what kinds of Islamophobia they were pushing. And it was only when we got to ask questions about where the funding was coming for these think tanks that we had our first clue that we were looking at something else. And the data we found was that something like the top 9 or 10 funders of these think tanks were these obscure British charities that we'd never heard of. And they were usually named after some individual or some family, and they were set up by members of that family. And these were rich individuals who were giving money to philanthropic causes. And amongst those causes were two Islamophobic think tanks. And so we looked at what else they were giving money to, and it turned out they were giving money to all these pro-Israel causes. So we sort of thought about this a little bit, and it took us a while to process this information. We realized what we were looking at here were Zionist family foundations. These were all foundations set up by Zionists to pursue Zionism, amongst other things. And one of the things that they were doing was pushing Islamophobia. And that's when we realized that we actually had a specific Zionist component of Islamophobia. And it was only that insight which then led us through the 2010s to look more specifically at what's called, what you've called the Israel lobby. And so we did some research on that. For example, we did a quite well-known report on BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communications Research Centre, in 2013. And what that did was it looked at the way in which this organisation was integrated with the British political establishment, and also the way in which it tried to influence the media. So it was only through doing that research that I came to understand that one of the things I was interested in was Zionism. And it was only because of that we started to do more and more research in the area. And as a result of doing that, of course, one of the first things that happened was that we were accused of being anti-Semitic. And when we were first accused of this, I really had no idea what they were talking about. But because we were accused of, me, a lifelong anti-racist, accused of being a racist, I wanted to find out more about what that was about, why they were saying this, who these people were, and what were the kind of their objectives. And so it's only as a result of that I started to get interested in the Israel lobby itself, and then latterly interested in what I call the Zionist movement, which is a much bigger thing than the Israel lobby. Maybe we'll come back to that later. And so that's how I got into this. I got into it because I started to look at Islamophobia, and then we realized that there was a specific Zionist component. And of course, when we started to say that, the Zionists didn't like that at all. And of course, there was a lot of pushback.
So is there anything illegal about what these lobby groups are doing? Because, of course, there are lots of lobby groups around Parliament, and technically, people would say, well, so what? If these groups are there, they're doing what anybody else would do. And of course, if Israeli interests are being lobbied for in the West, that's no different from the Saudis or from the Americans or anybody else. So what's the troublesome aspect of Israeli lobbying as compared to maybe others?
Well, I mean, the way I would put this is to say that this is not Israeli lobbying. This is Zionist lobbying, and in order to understand what that distinction is, I think one needs to understand what the Zionist movement is. And so I can give you a long history of this if you like, but let's cut that and try and give the bare bones of the movement and how that relates to the lobby. So the Zionist movement was created in the late 19th century, the creation of an organization called the Zionist Organization, which later became renamed the World Zionist Organization. And it has various other organizations which were associated with it. And that forms the backbone of the Zionist movement. And the aim of that movement was to set up a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine. And when it came to 1948, and they successfully did that in the course of expelling 750,000 Palestinians in the Nakba, then they had to work out what they were going to do next. And so in 1951, they met in Jerusalem and said, shall we demobilize the Zionist movement, or shall we continue the Zionist movement? And they voted, not a single vote against, to continue the Zionist movement. And ever since then, they've had a strategy, it's called the Jerusalem Programme, named after that meeting in 1951, to pursue the interests of Zionism worldwide. It's called the World Zionist Organization. It has branches in something like 35 countries around the world, of course, important ones in the UK, the US, Germany, France, etc. So the Zionist movement is there to pursue the interests of the Israeli state, and it's there to pursue them throughout the world wherever they are organized. And as part of that, what they do is they engage in what activities we would describe as being the Israel lobby. That is trying to influence government policy, whether domestic or foreign policy, in the countries where they're organized. But the Zionist movement does a lot more than that, of course. It also helps to effectively radicalize young Jews into believing that they have a birthright to the territory of Palestine. So that's an important element of what they do. And also the Zionist movement spends a lot of time directly supporting the activities that are going on in Palestine. So that's settlement, for example, the so-called Israel Defense Forces. So a lot of money comes from the Zionist movement in the UK, the US and elsewhere to support those activities that are ongoing in Palestine. So I would see that as the three key aspects of the Zionist movement. There's the lobbying, there's the radicalization of young Jews, and then there's supporting what's happening in Palestine. And when people talk about the Israel lobby, they're really only talking about a small fraction of the activities of the Zionist movement, and it's important to have that conception, I think.
The Jewish communities in Britain have lived here a very long time. British Board of Jewish Deputies, or deputy, the specific title that they have, seems to be a very prominent one. The chief rabbi is very active. All of them are highly connected and are highly respected within the British establishment. You've indicated, of course, now that they have themselves embedded, perhaps in schools, Jewish schools, or the Jewish communities, synagogues perhaps, other establishments outside of the Jewish community as well. If I was to compare that, say I was to pick on, say, the Hindutva movement in India, which also is an ideological political movement. There may be Islamist movements. You know, we could say the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, for instance. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood. That's another sort of movement which is on the surface, which would be problematic for many people, and is. The British government has prescribed many organisations linked to that movement, Hizb ut-Tahrir for one, for that matter. So clearly the establishment has its likes and dislikes about movements. The socialist movement, the communist movement, these are all movements as well. I'm trying to sort of ascertain why the Zionist movement would be a problem. Why would that be a problem for Britain?
Well, I mean, the Zionist movement is a problem for Britain because it enables the British state to support genocide in Gaza. I mean, it's as straightforward as that. How is that different to the Hindutva movement? Well, the Hindutva movement is also and it's a movement which is very close to the Zionists. Actually, it's also an ethno-supremacist movement. But how the Zionist movement operates is through what's called the Jewish community. Now, you mentioned schools, so there are no Ikhwani Muslim Brotherhood schools. There are no Salafist schools in this country. There are Muslim schools, certainly. There are Jewish schools too, but most of the Jewish schools are themselves expressly Zionist, not just religious schools. So, and that's the distinction which one should make. It's perfectly legitimate, it seems to me, for there to be Jewish schools and Hindu schools and Muslim schools, and indeed, of course, Christian schools. Most schools in this country are Christian schools. But it's not legitimate, for example, for those schools to push a particular ideology, which is not intimately linked to the religion, down children's throats. So it's not legitimate to push the Orange Order, a particular Protestant sect, which of course is very important in the conflict in Ireland. Wouldn't be legitimate for there to be schools which say that they are Protestant supremacist organisations. Wouldn't be legitimate.
Have you dug up evidence of this politicization or the weaponization of Zionism within Jewish schools? Is there evidence of that?
Absolutely. Well, look, this is why I say that it's important to understand the Zionist movement, because this is not the Israel lobby. It's nothing to do with the Israel lobby, right? It's to do with the radicalization of Jewish kids into supporting ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. That's the purpose of it. And if you look at the schools, I had no idea this was happening. But when I started to look at it, and you look at these are schools which on their websites refer to themselves as being Zionist schools. And that's truly, truly extraordinary. There are no schools in this country which say on their websites that they're Hindutva schools. There's not a single one. There are no schools in this country which say that they are supporters of the Orange Order or the Ulster Volunteer Force or any of those things. There is no such thing. And that's because there's a distinction drawn between the politics and ideology which might be based in a particular religion and the actual religion itself. And that's the distinction which the Zionist schools, not all Jewish schools, but most Jewish schools are Zionist, fail to make. And so that's a problem. Now, you mentioned synagogues as well. There are many synagogues in this country which are Zionist. Most synagogues are Zionist. Most of the synagogue movements are Zionist. The United Synagogue, Masorti, Reform, Liberal, all of them are officially signed up to the Zionist movement. No, not just covertly, but officially signed up to the Zionist movement. And that's all part of the inculcation of the idea in young Jews going on to be teenagers and then young adults that they have a right to settle and occupy Palestinian territory. And of course, there are a whole range of other of youth groups and then young adult groups where they track the idea of the closeness between Jews and Israel all the way through the life course. That's what the main Zionist organizations say that they do. They say that they want to have encourage a sort of closeness between Jewish people and Israel throughout the whole of their life course. So that I think is an issue which we haven't really understood in this country, that there is this kind of deep political influence in almost all the institutions of the organised Jewish community.
I do find it rather curious. There's a hypocrisy for sure that I've noticed myself. I mean, when the notions of kibbutzes, the idea of the Israeli Defence Force having British citizens also serving in there and coming back. I mean, I know just one of the hostages, which is supposed to have been released in the latest batch, was a British Zionist serving in the IDF. And she'll probably come back to Britain and nobody will ask any questions. She might even be treated as a hero. Is this... I want to compare this, because if that was done, say somebody was to go and serve in the Pakistan army, for instance, and they were a British Pakistani living here, would there be an element of sort of compromise of interest, of your own national interest by doing such things?
Well, look, I mean, the recruitment into... they have a specific program for this in occupied Palestine called the Lone Soldier Program, where they recruit British or Argentinian or American or French or German citizens to join the IDF. And they recruit them into that from a very, very early age. They start to have visits by the IDF to schools, to youth clubs, and then they have, in many of the schools, they have trips to Israel when the kids are like 12, 13, 14. They take them over to Israel for a long time. They have propaganda trips there, and that's part of the process of recruiting them into the IDF. Now, that shouldn't be allowed. It shouldn't be allowed that they join the IDF. The IDF is a force which everybody knows is engaged in significant war crimes, and yet there is no pushback in the UK or the US or other places against that. Now, you said she might come back as a hero. Well, she might come back as a hero to some elements of the Zionist community in this country, but she will also come back and face determined efforts by lawyers to have her arrested and to have her charged with war crimes, which is happening all over the world. We're seeing in Belgium, in South Africa, in Latin America, attempts to prosecute these people and to make sure that they either can't visit the country, or that if they do visit, that they can be arrested and charged with war crimes. And that's going to be something which is going to follow every single IDF person whenever they travel anywhere. So as long as the lawyers can find out about them. So this is an ongoing process, and we're going to see the ripples effects of this, for many years to come.
Well, the British legal system, I guess, would have a stance on such things. I'm not aware of what it is, but obviously this is going to test the legal system. But I mean, I can't, for the life of me, of course, there are clear areas. The H group, the two H groups in the Middle East, the ISIS fraternity, Shamima Begum comes to mind as cases, jihadi brides was a big deal. The government was very clear on these things, and they prescribed certain organisations. So in those instances, the law is very clear. Is it as clear in this field?
I don't think that's true. You mentioned before, you used the word Islamist. Now, I think that the term Islamist is a term which is a racist term, which is a term which brings together all of those Muslims who think that their faith should provide some guide to their conduct and their life and their politics. Now that brings together supporters of Al-Qaeda, of course, with those people who support the opposition to the genocide in Gaza. And that's plainly ridiculous, since of course these groups are actually fighting each other in practice, for example, in Lebanon or Syria. Now, but the government has this weird kind of double standard, doesn't it? It says, Yvette Cooper said this in Parliament just a few days ago, we have to make sure that we have more Islamists being referred to the government's counterterrorism programme, Prevent. And of course, what they mean by that is all Muslims. But they specifically mean those Muslims who are opposed to the genocide in Gaza. Because, of course, when it comes to its own interests, the British government is quite happy to support those organisations, which it deems to be prescribed, illegal terrorist organisations, when it supports its foreign policy objectives. So, for example, Al-Qaeda is listed as a prescribed organisation, and indeed the Nusra Front, which was its successor in Syria and Iraq, and indeed the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the organisation which currently rules Syria. Those organisations are both listed as being simply alternative names for Al-Qaeda, and those are illegal organisations. Nevertheless, the government is deciding whether it shall make Al-Qaeda a legal organisation, truly an extraordinary set of affairs.
Absolutely extraordinary indeed.
But of course, the issue is that actually the government has supported Al-Qaeda, Nusra, HTS, and indeed ISIS in that conflict, because it was a conflict which they fought against the government of Bashar al-Assad, who was an opponent of the West and, of course, a supporter of the Palestinian resistance. So the government has a double-dealing approach to this. It doesn't actually oppose these organisations when it suits it. And that you mentioned Shamima Begum. Of course, there's a key example of this. The reason that Shamima Begum can't come back, and the reason that she's been denied British citizenship, is not because she's a bad person who married someone in ISIS. It's because she was recruited and taken over the border by British intelligence operatives. So she was effectively an asset of British intelligence. And if she came back and there was a trial, all of that would come out in court, and they cannot have that. And that's why, of course, they want to have proper court cases for those kinds of people, because it means that the involvement of the British intelligence services working with prescribed organisations as proxies would explode in the courts, and that would, of course, be something which the British government would at least prefer not to happen.
Well, I can corroborate that in 2012, when the foreign minister of France, I think it was Roland, went public and told off MI5 for supporting the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, essentially the recruiting ground for ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, it was clear that the British were involved, and certainly the CIA would have been involved. So there's certainly evidence, and of course the likes of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and with the WikiLeaks scenarios, there are lots of means of evidencing what you're saying. I get that, but coming back to what you were talking about, the responsibility of the British government and indeed the Americans as well, with their counter-terrorism programs, their responsibility with Prevent here in Britain. People mostly would say, yeah, that's great. We like the idea that anybody who's potentially a terrorist and a threat to us gets investigated, and they've got the Channel program, and Prevent has other programs it's rolled out for over 2 decades. And organisations like the Henry Jackson, who you maintained earlier, were linked to Quilliam, led by Majid Nawaz and others. So there's clearly a huge infrastructure for dealing with anything they regard as countering terrorism when it comes to Muslims. When it comes to this business of an organisation which has been essentially condemned by the ICJ and the ICC, by these international courts, being treated in a way which is essentially as terrorists, state operating terrorists, albeit, will this give Prevent and the British government in its counter-terrorism strategies something to think about? Will they have to take this seriously? Will they take it seriously?
Well, no, they won't. Of course, they won't take it seriously, because they are big supporters of the genocide, and so they will do everything they can to avoid the possibility that people who are war criminals will not be charged with such crimes. And you can see that in the way in which Prevent operates. Prevent operates to stop Muslims being active in British public life, and especially in anti-imperialist politics, anti-war politics, Palestine solidarity politics. That's the purpose of Prevent. It's not about preventing terrorism, because, of course, we know perfectly well that the British government is perfectly content not only to allow terrorism, but to recruit terrorists to pursue their own foreign policy objectives. I mean, the best example, I guess, is the Manchester bomber, isn't it? I mean, Salman Abedi, who is, of course, the son of a Muammar Gaddafi intelligence agent who swapped sides, was recruited by MI6. Salman Abedi was trafficked. It was clear at the time. He turns up to fly to Libya to join the jihad against Colonel Gaddafi, and the police stop him, and he says, it's all right. And the police phone up MI5, and MI5 say, yeah, it's fine enough, let him go. And they traffic these people off to go and participate in their proxy war in Libya. And then what happens at the end of it? The Royal Navy evacuates these people. And Salman Abedi comes back to this country, having engaged in what can only be described as terrorism, in fact, with a group which the British government described as terrorist, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and he then blows up all those civilians in Manchester. So that kind of example of the role the British state in terrorism in this country is something which, of course, the British state's going to go nowhere near, and where we don't have any proper democratic accountability for that kind of activity.
Well, of course, Giuliani, and the head of essentially the Syrian Liberation Force, I guess some would argue, is also now being touted as a sort of, he's being regroomed, redesigned and rebranded. And in fact, British officials are meeting him publicly and looking at how they can, Tony Blair met him at Davos and was hobnobbing with that fraternity. It seems as though you've got evidence to suggest that Britain does change the goalposts as and when it wants to on terrorism. That seems to be a pretty undeniable reality given what they're doing now. But focusing back on the British Zionist movement, Of course, the Rothschilds were involved in supporting Zionism initially in creating Palestine. You talk about these families and these kinds of funding bodies which operate perfectly legally within Britain. And we have to talk about even our Prime Minister at the moment, Keir Starmer, who is, I think, married to a Jew as well himself, and he is, that's no crime in that. But it's very easy to conflate this issue of being anti-Semitic, and it seems to be done almost immediately. When people talk about Zionism, it does seem as though you're immediately going to be assaulted with the anti-Semitic notion, because the distinction between Jewish culture, Jewish ethnicity, and the Jewish faith seems to have been muddied over time. No other ethnic group, has quite that kind of situation. It's extraordinary, and it's very, very difficult, I guess, for anybody to speak about Zionism without anti-Semitism being levelled at them.
Well, of course, and that's a strategy which the Israeli government have been developing for more than 50 years now. I mean, the famous statement, of course, was made by Abba Eban when he was the foreign minister of the Zionist entity in the States in 1973, 2 or 3, I believe, and where he said that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism, and that we must spend all of our time making sure that people all over the world understand that that's what that is. And they of course, spent a lot of time and effort in trying to bring the two things together, including, of course, giving Mossad the lead role in this globally, and then from 2000, they're setting up the Global Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, which, of course, was a mechanism for creating the idea of a definition of anti-Semitism, which would include anti-Israel sentiment, which of course is completely antithetical to the idea of anti-Semitism, which of course was always traditionally regarded as being a form of racism against the Jews, as opposed to criticism of Zionism. And so of course they spent a lot of time doing that, and then they wrote a working definition, as they called it then, and they managed to lodge that with the European Union Monitoring Centre, which is the European Union's official body for anti-racism. And they lodged that on the website of the EUMC. It was eventually dropped when the EUMC became the Fundamental Rights Agency, which still exists. And so, of course, there was a panic in the Zionist camp in 2011-12, and they said, we've got to find a way of lodging this somewhere else. And you can see this in the documents. The documents are all on the web. And they say, okay, well, so we'll find somewhere else for this working definition to go. And of course, they found the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and they lodged it with them in 2015. And then it was used as the weapon de jure to take on Corbyn, to take on Bernie Sanders, to take on the German left, to take on the French left. And that's what they've done. Of course, that's the strategy, right? So the Zionists have done this for a long, long time, and they've been very successful in using that as a tactic. The IHRA, as you'll know, has been adopted by every single police force in this country, every government department, so that whenever you have any official data on hate crime against the Jews, what you find is that this definition has been used, and of course that means that all of the data is fundamentally compromised. So when you see the police or the Home Office saying that there's been a huge increase in anti-Semitism since Al-Aqsa flood in October 2023, well, what we're seeing there is a huge increase in criticism of Zionism, nothing to do with anti-Semitism at all. And so the whole thing is a farrago. It's a nonsense from start to finish. But it's not just that the Zionists have been pursuing this, but it's that their pursuit of this holy grail of merging anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has been endorsed by the British state, by the US state, by governments all over the world, so that it's very, very difficult for people to actually engage in proper discussion about this, because the Zionists have, I mean, control is a strong term, but they have control over the definition of what anti-Semitism is, and it's a completely fake definition. So there we have evidence, if we needed evidence of the power of Zionism to intimidate, to bully, and to make sure that Western countries will go along with their wishes.
Well, I googled something to do with Zionism and the British state just quickly today, just as a little exercise. And the first thing that came up was the word the terms conspiracy theory. That it was a very popular conspiracy theory, and they called it Zog, I think, something to do with Zog. So immediately you try to question this, or even search for it. It seems that there's a very powerful, even online ability, because Facebook have even adopted a former Israeli justice minister, I believe, on their fact checkers board, and that's a special dispensation given to that individual, and have then been evidenced as interfering with the way the Palestine cause is projected on their sites. It's very clear that they censor, they shadow ban Palestinian folk. And in fact, I think Zuckerberg even admitted it, and has just recently said they're going to relax their kind of their censorship, perhaps. Of course, I could go on with social media, but it seems that this Zionist power isn't just in the corridors of political power, not even just in the schools. It seems to go into the media, and I could name the Barclay brothers and Rupert Murdoch for two, who are very, very powerful players in the British media that have very strong Zionist inclinations and leanings. But what's your take on the way the narrative is controlled, and how much power do Zionists have in controlling narratives?
Well, I think it's not so much a question of. I think narratives is the wrong place to start. I mean, narratives is part of the question. But what you see is you see Zionist infiltration in all industries. Yes, in politics. Yes, in culture. Yes, in the media industry. Yes, in social media. Yes, in the entertainment, in film, music industries. There are all sorts of Zionist infiltrators, and that's something which people, I think, are not really aware of. And again, that's not really a question of the Israel lobby, because yes, of course, there are Israel lobby groups trying to make sure that there's no one in rap music who's pro-Palestinian. And of course, there is all those kinds of pressures. But internally, inside these corporations, you find that the most senior people very often are Zionists, and will give money to the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces, or have connections with all sorts of Israel lobby groups. So that it's about the infiltration by Zionists of all aspects of the society, and that's really something which is which is really not the same as the Israel lobby, and it's something which gives them the extra element of power, which you don't have if you're Muslim or if you're Hindu. So if you look at the statistics on, I don't know, say the BBC television news journalists, you find that Muslims are systematically underrepresented in the BBC in the journalism department, whereas Jews are overrepresented. Now, of course, what you find then at that level is that most Jews are Zionists, and so that means that there's a kind of preferential input for Zionism, even in television news.
Are there statistics to back up what you said in terms of most Jewish?
This is BBC data, right? So at the senior level of news and current affairs in the BBC, Jews are 5 times more likely than their proportion of the population to be a senior BBC journalist. Muslims are half as likely as the proportion of the population. So, and those kinds of proportions are the same. It's the same in the civil service, in most civil service departments, not all, but most civil service departments. And so that of course means that when it comes for the tap on the shoulder, the moment that a Zionist who happens to work in the BBC or happens to work in the Department for Work and Pensions, when the tap on the shoulder comes to do the right thing for the Zionist cause, well then quite often that's very successful. So and that's the way in which this infiltration works. Is that the Zionists want to encourage this strong identification with Israel all the way through Jewish people's lives. And that works very successfully with most Jews, but obviously there are anti-Zionists and non-Zionists, etc. It works very, very successfully with most Jews, so that when the tap on the shoulder comes, then of course there's a kind of expectation, and quite often a successful expectation, that the right thing will be done. And that's how you see what happens in social media, in Facebook or in X, formerly Twitter. These corporations are effectively controlled by Zionist influence. Even if it's the case that there are other Zionist groups claiming that they are anti-Semitic. So I mean, let's take the example of Elon Musk. I mean, that's the case there, right?
Well, let me extend this a little bit. I know about, with my research, Unit 8200. I've known about it for maybe over a decade.
Yeah.
The Unit 8200 was basically set up in Israel to become the cyber warfare experts. And it seems that over a period of time they were hugely successful with that, creating a very powerful big tech kind of network infrastructure there in Tel Aviv and beyond. But then the story kind of accelerated, because it seems as though those people who were in Unit 8200 and did their work for the Israeli military and the Israeli government then got spread out.
Sure.
And so what sort of information do you have on that?
So
what impact does that have?
So this is part of the foreign policy strategies of the Zionist entity, is to seed their people throughout the tech industry, and they've set up a huge number of tech companies in Israel and then internationally, which have the purpose of engaging in engaging contracts and being recruited by governments and others around the world. And of course that gives the Israeli intelligence services access to stuff that they wouldn't otherwise have. Let me give you some examples. So for example, Oracle is a company, one of the biggest companies in the world, which has a multi-billion pound contracts with the British government to provide cloud services for the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, the NHS and the Home Office. That's all the key national security infrastructure government departments. And Oracle is run by a guy who openly says that he's a Zionist first and foremost. And of course, what you see there is the potential that the Zionist intelligence apparatus has to penetrate the British national security infrastructure and architecture. And people don't see that as a problem. We also have, as another example, the UK-Israel Tech Hub, which is an organisation set up inside the British Embassy in Tel Aviv, which the function of which, and it's partly funded by the British government, the function of which is to make sure that Israeli tech startups can get contracts in Britain. Now, almost all of these tech startups in Israel are staffed by people who used to be Israeli intelligence operatives. Now, and does nobody think that's a strange thing? I mean, do we have a similar thing? Do we have ex-CIA people or ex-people from GCHQ taking jobs in high-tech industry in Israel? No, we don't. And nor is it the case with India or with Russia or with China or with any other country. But we nevertheless have seen, as a matter of foreign policy, the Israelis making sure that their ex-intelligence agents can penetrate the high-tech industry. And they've done that very, very successfully. And of course, they've been supported in that job with the UK-Israel Tech Hub by the British government itself. And that's an indication of really how far the problems go. And again, that's nothing to do with the Israel lobby. Right? Nothing at all to do with the Israel lobby. All the Israel lobby groups, nothing to do with them at all. And so you even have the case, so for example, that the White House, during Clinton's time, commissioned an Israeli company to provide the telecom system for the White House. And it's an Israeli company which is set up by Unit 8200 veterans. And do we imagine that the Israelis were not listening to and compromising White House officials with the data which they gathered? Do we imagine that Jeffrey Epstein's compromise operation wasn't and isn't to do with actually compromising key leaders? We already know, don't we, that Netanyahu offered the tapes of Lewinsky and Clinton to Clinton should he release Jonathan Pollard, the Israeli spy. Now, he didn't accede to that request, but that shows the level of compromise being used as a foreign policy tool by the Israelis. And that's something which I think people have no idea about.
Well, the Pegasus spy mechanism has been, it's been exposed. Yeah. It's a reality. Everybody knows that they were spying on journalists, are spying on journalists. That goes from Bangladesh through to, I've seen evidence of it being done even in other countries. So how far that goes, anybody knows. But what we're beginning to build up is a really kind of quite a dangerous tapestry of if you like, influence and surveillance and information and knowledge and the power of bending narratives in a way which would affect ordinary people. I mean, let me extend this a little bit further to the technological and the military sector. I know Loki has been doing a lot of work around Elbit, for instance, and others have as well. And there's been a targeting of Elbit, which is an Israeli front company, and which is also connected to, I believe, funding which Saudi Arabia gave to certain elements within Israel. So that now this nexus of Zionist influence doesn't restrict itself to the Atlantic powers. It's quite clearly in most of the very rich Arab Muslim nations, in those leaderships, there's plenty of evidence to say the likes of Qatar and Saudi Arabia are also involved in this kind of Zionist network. But what research have you found in terms of the tech and the military field where there are problems and threats for
look, I mean, the NSO group and Pegasus, I mean, these are, again, another aspect of what we've just been talking about. When you mention Saudi, I mean, this is again something which I think people don't understand. Earlier in the discussion, you said, "Well, imagine if there were Saudi schools, etc." Well, imagine if there were Saudi schools, but actually, what we find is that there is Saudi money in this country, and that is important, and it's important to be looking at. But actually, the role of the Saudis, and indeed of the United Arab Emirates, is a role which is developed in alliance with the Zionists. So the whole process of normalization of Zionism throughout the whole of West Asia is led by the UAE and the Saudis. And of course, there's a close collaboration between those three countries. The Saudis, of course, have, at a public level, pretended that they weren't really doing that, but they have been doing that for many years now. And we've seen that the way in which that operates in the US and in the UK. So, for example, it was the United Arab Emirates who pressured the British government, when Cameron was Prime Minister, to do an investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood in this country, led by a former, unbelievably, led by a former MI6 officer who had been the former liaison with the Syrian moderate armed opposition, i.e. with the Ikhwan, right? And that was pressured by the UAE under threat of cancelling British Petroleum and BAE Systems contracts, and Britain went along with it. Now that whole thing is about the collaboration with Israel and the normalization of Israel. Now you mentioned Qatar. Of course, Qatar is a slightly different case because it's not in the vanguard of normalization. But nevertheless, there are questions about the role of Qatar, and we saw just before Trump became president that Jared Kushner upped his involvement with Saudi money, and what that means is an increased investment in firms which will benefit from settlement either in Gaza or in the West Bank or in other places as well. So we have a confluence of business interests, which of course have the effect, all of them, of selling out the Palestinians and making sure that the Palestinians don't ever gain liberation. So that's what we've seen in the last year. The tectonic plates of the states, the Arab states in the region, working together with the Israelis to bypass and sideline the Palestinians, and that's something again which people aren't really very aware of. Well, I think in this country.
I mean, Keir Starmer, Donald Trump, most of the Western powers will say our interests, foreign policy interests, are integrally reliant on Israel's strength. And therefore, we give our bases in Cyprus to fly planes, British airplanes to do surveillance over Lebanon and Palestine. We support the Israeli army in all sorts of ways militarily, albeit mostly clandestinely, but certainly in terms of arms licenses, it's clear that we support them. And it's clear that statements by the leaders of Britain and America in particular have given full carte blanche to all actions taken by the IDF in Palestine. All of that is abroad. Now, an average British citizen will say, well, what's that got to do with me? If Israel are serving our interests, then forget about the moral question, forget about genocides. The bottom line is they're serving our interests, and we must always back our own interests. There seems to be a kind of a deficit of morality within politics as a whole, generally, certainly in British politics. But where do you stand in terms of where the average British citizen should be concerned? Does it bother us that something's happening in foreign policy which doesn't necessarily sit well with our values? Or is it that our economic interests supersede those?
Well, I mean, first of all, people don't know. So the things you've just mentioned, you said you used the word clandestine. And these things are clandestine. The British government doesn't admit that it sends the spy flights from its two bases in Cyprus over Lebanon and Palestine. It doesn't admit it. It doesn't admit they've been doing it since the ceasefire was signed in Gaza.
But the flight patterns are all there. They've been evidence, haven't they?
Yeah, they're on social media. If you declassified have been tweeting about it, of course. Yeah. If you follow that, then you know. But do most people in Britain know about this?
No.
No, of course they don't.
No.
Do they know about their arms licenses? Some of them will know about some of that.
Very few.
And of course the training of the IDF, again, complete denotice. No one in the mainstream will talk about that. I mean, as people have been saying, you know, the British state has been arresting journalists for the last 9 months. Eastman Stanley, Sarah Wilkinson, Ali Munaba from the Electronic Intifada was arrested in Switzerland just a few days ago.
Yes.
Does anyone in Britain who reads the mainstream press know this? There hasn't been a mention. It's not on the BBC. It's not mentioned anywhere. So people don't know.
Is that deliberate?
First of all, is it deliberate? Well, of course it's deliberate. I mean, this is a system for controlling the news, which has become extremely effective. Now, it used to be the case when there was contest in politics, it was much easier, if I can be sympathetic to the broadcasters for a minute, much easier for them to portray an alternative account because there were people in Parliament, Labour MPs especially, sometimes SNP MPs, who would say the alternative thing, who would give the information. And that made it easier. Labour says this, so you say that. But now we don't have that dispute in politics. There is no dispute in politics. There is a very, very narrow distinction between Labour and Tory, as people have been saying for many years now, at least since 1997, when Tony Blair was elected as Thatcher's successor, effectively. And so it's very, very difficult now to find out alternative information, like the basic information that you've just been talking about, that you know and I know, but most people in Britain have got no idea about. No idea at all. So that's the first thing I say, that people don't know. And then, so the question is, well, what would happen if they did know? And of course, we know that if people knew, they wouldn't tolerate it, and that's why they mustn't know. I mean, that's what they say in the Foreign Office files when you look at them 30 years later. People cannot know, because otherwise they would object. But you said something about morality too. And I think there's a wider question here, which is a wider historical question. I think, look, our society, meaning the UK and other Western European societies too, is in a cultural and political crisis. And I think that what we're seeing is a kind of slow motion collapse of the West. Now, of course, we saw that, I guess, with the Russian intervention in Ukraine, the rise of the BRICS, the question of even the Saudis abandoning the dollar for oil transfers. There's a kind of collapse of Western authority, which has been coming for a long, long time now, but which is, I think, becoming a sort of crisis. And that is, that crisis is only exacerbated by the manifest lawlessness of the genocide in Gaza. I mean, everybody sees it. The ICJ sees it. Everybody sees it. Even people who only watch the BBC see what's happening and see what the Israelis are doing. Of course, there are some people who believe all of the lies, but most people are aware that there's a genocide happening, and the moral authority of the West And the whole question of international human rights, international law, has completely collapsed. And that's not something you can put back in. So if, yes, of course, the government might say, well, the Israelis, they defend our interests in the Middle East. If it wasn't, what was it Biden said, if it wasn't for, if the Israelis weren't there, we'd have to invent them. Of course they might say that, but they know that when people find out the truth, that they turn right away from that, and they will not tolerate it. And that's why they have to try and control the media, try and suppress the protests, try and arrest the journalists, try and say, oh, what's happening is these are hate marches, or this is hatred against the Jews, and all this kind of nonsense is an attempt to suppress the possibility of popular pressure for change, which is quite significant.
Well, I think you've touched on a few things which might be cause for concern for British citizens, because if, as a result of Zionist lobbies or this Zionist movement and it serving the interests of Israel and the global Zionist movement, which seems to be a very shadowy entity, although we've evidenced a lot of areas where it has an extraordinary amount of influence, if that's the case, then that means our rights to protest, our freedom of speech, our ability to say what we want about certain religions or religious beliefs in terms of Judaism and others, it seems that it is affecting us. I mean, all of these things I could probably say actually are impacting the ordinary lives of British citizens. So it's not just about foreign policy. These have palpable reverberations for the way our British democracy, for the way our ordinary liberties and freedoms are affected. So I'm going to ask that question about how much impact there is on ordinary lives, but also start turning to solutions in the last 10, 15 minutes that we have to look at. I've heard the notion of an anti-Zionist movement being bandied about. I mean, does it have to get as bold and brave as that in terms of a stance? Because the Zionist movement itself doesn't put itself forward as a Zionist movement. So it's, in a way, you're kind of punching thin air in a way with something like this. That it's not a formal body as such. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, the strange thing about that is that it is a formal body.
Okay.
The Zionist movement is a formal body, right?
All right.
Let me just deal with that briefly. So I mentioned before at the beginning of this that the World Zionist Organization was created in the last part of the 19th century. And there are various other bodies associated with it: the Jewish National Fund, Keren Hazod, the main fundraising body for Israel, and the Jewish Agency. And they all have branches in the UK and France and Germany. And
so this is the institutional footprint.
And then, of course, there's a Zionist Federation in the UK, and it has something like 35 members. All of them are formally signed up to this Jerusalem program, which is the manifesto of the Zionist movement. In the US, the Zionist Federation is called the American Zionist Movement. So they do put their name on the tin. And of course, but you're right that they're sort of diffident about that. But there is plainly a formal Zionist movement. And all of the Zionist organizations that are signed up to that, which are effectively affiliated to the World Zionist Organization, are part of the formal Zionist movement. Almost all of the Israel lobby groups are not formally Zionist. Right? They're not formally affiliated, but they're, of course, part of the wider movement. So, yes, there's a perfectly identifiable Zionist movement, and there's a lot in this country. I would say there are 3,000 Zionist organizations.
Wow, 3,000.
Yeah.
And do they put that on their websites? Do they reveal that?
Many of them don't have websites, but the formal Zionist movement in this country is roughly 125 organizations. Okay,
that's extraordinary.
And then outside of that, there are all the Israel lobby groups. You mentioned the Board of Deputies. It's not formally part of the Zionist movement. It has 222 members. The last time I counted, they've taken them off their website last year, so we can't tell. So when you add all of those organizations together, plus all the charities, which I mentioned before, the Zionist family foundations, plus the organizations to which they give money, some of which are in occupied Palestine, some of which are here, including money directly to the IDF, money to the settlements, money to destroy Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, all of that, these are organizations which people have got no idea what they are. That many of them don't have websites, but huge sums of money are going from the UK to support the genocide. Look, one example, the UK Friends of the Association for the Wellbeing of Israel's Soldiers, UK charity, right? and it gives money directly to the IDF. Now, we exposed this, and other journalists did too, last year, and as a result of this, the organisation went dark. It took down its Facebook page, it took down its Twitter account, it took down its website, and it still hasn't come back up. But it's currently negotiating with the Charity Commission, because there's been a complaint about it, giving money to the IDF, which is not a charitable objective, is not legal in this country, and they have tried to find a way to explain they're not really giving money to the IDF. But of course, that's what they're doing. It was, the material to show that was on their website. They took it off. We've of course got copies. So look, there's a really important way of understanding this, which is that these are manifestly existing organisations. That Zionism is inherently a racist ideology, and like all other racist ideologies, it should be brought to an end. And so your question is, what is this thing we're fighting against? Well, it's perfectly plain. These are organisations which have got names and addresses. They've got lawyers, they've got accountants, they've got financial advisors, and each of them have got addresses. We know who these people are, we know where they are, and so we therefore can start to say these are racist organisations and they shouldn't be allowed to exist. The Charity Commission should remove their charitable status. We should take court cases against them to remove them from existence. But there's a need for an anti-Zionist movement in order to accomplish that task. Now, one caveat is that, look, there are clearly Jewish communal organisations which have a legitimate function in representing Jews, but they cannot be representing Jews as Zionists. They cannot be racists. So what do you do with those organisations? What do you do about the Union of Jewish Students, which is formally Zionist? What do you do about the schools which are Zionist, which are including formally Zionist schools? Well, what you do is you ask them to disaffiliate from the Zionist movement. It's quite straightforward. All they've got to do is take a decision, write a letter, and we're done. And that's what we need to do. We need to end Zionism because it's a racist ideology, and we have to end it by ending all of the organisations which are Zionist, or having them to disaffiliate from the movement.
Is it legally easy to identify the Zionist movement as racist? Because you've said that several times. Israel, of course, it's easy to evidence that they have an apartheid system going on within Israel, but this broader global Zionist movement, is it possible to point the finger at them and prove that they are racists?
Well, I mean, if you look at the statements of the leaders of the movement from the very beginning, it's perfectly plain. They were racist from the beginning, they were colonial from the beginning, and indeed they were genocidal from the beginning.
Yeah, Ben-Gurion and
all of them. Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, Chaim Weizmann, all of them. And so it's perfectly. I mean, I did this in my tribunal where I was sat by the University of Bristol, and I took them to tribunal and I won. I had a 120-page witness statement, and in that I went through this in great detail. These are the organisations, these are the individuals, this is what they believed. And of course, in order for there to be a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine, which is what Zionism is, they have to be racist because they have to expel the indigenous people, the Palestinians. And they always envisaged that, and that's what they've done. I mean, there is no way of having a Jewish state, meaning a state where Jews have more rights than everyone else, without it being racist. There's no such thing as an anti-racist Jewish state. And that's the problem. If they were able to find a way of doing that without having to displace the native population, well, then that might be a different question. But they can't do that in a country where there's already a native population.
That's an extraordinary set of facts that you've mapped out through this program, and I'm kind of reeling, really. I need to go back and visit each one of these issues, and it could be a program made on several aspects and themes that we raised, and to go into further depth with them. And I know some researchers like Loki, yourself, and others are already doing this very well. But certainly, it's worth exploring. I'm the only connection that I haven't made, and this is the last point I'm going to really put to you. All of this needs money. This kind of scale of movement and influence and power requires huge amounts of money. Yeah. But we have sort of sinkholes almost. The City of London, Wall Street. There are financial institutions which are impossible to penetrate almost because of the way that they're constituted. I'd say the City of London, Corporation of London is one of those. And if I was to also suggest that individuals within some of the most powerful corporates, financial drivers of global industry and wealth around the world seem to have very strong affiliations to this Zionist movement that you talk about. I could name BlackRock's Larry Fink as one, Sheldon Adelson, his foundation, he's died now, but his wife Miriam has backed Donald Trump in a big way.
Of course.
How powerfully backed is this Zionist movement on the financial front and from particularly the transnational corporate sector?
Well, I mean, look, the Jews in this country make up 0.5% of the population. In America, they're 2.5% of the population. In this country, Muslims are 6.5% of the population, according to the last census. So, there's a really very small minority of people who are Jewish in this country. But nevertheless, when you look at the rankings of billionaires that you get on Forbes or any of the other rankings, then what you find is that 20% of the top billionaires, of the top 1,000 billionaires, are Jewish. So that's a massive overrepresentation, which means that, and you can see that if you look at the data in the UK, for example, that Jews are on average are much better off than everybody else, including on average white people. So, and people don't understand that.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that per se.
There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but of course what happens is that in the context of Zionism and genocide, then the people at the top of that economic structure are overwhelmingly Zionist. Of the 20% of billionaires who are Jewish, how many of them are anti-Zionist? And I can answer that. And the only person who anyone would ever say was anti-Zionist would be George Soros. And George Soros is not an anti-Zionist. George Soros is a Zionist. But he, of course, is a liberal Zionist and takes a different view on some things from the more right-wing Zionists. There aren't any anti-Zionists amongst the top Jewish billionaires. There aren't any. There simply aren't any. And so that's the issue. Most Jewish anti-Zionists are not billionaires. They are, unsurprisingly, they're in the public sector. They come from middle class or lower middle class
movements
families.
like Natura Kartai and others.
Oh, and of course there's the religious anti-Zionists, there's the secular anti-Zionists who are on the left. And I suppose the Jewish Voice for Labour, they're not an anti-Zionist organisation, but there are anti-Zionists in that organisation. Natura Kartai, of course, is a religious anti-Zionist organisation.
So there are Jews who are anti-Zionist.
Of course, yes, that's right. But they're a very small minority, as everybody knows. But at the level of the economic structure or the political structure, the people at the top are almost all Zionists, and that's because if you're an anti-Zionist, you don't get promoted to those top positions.
Well, it's been an extraordinary journey. We've come to the end, Sadiana, but I will love to re-invite you and maybe bring on others who are researching this issue. And it's an area which, of course, we are vulnerable because nobody wants to be anti-Semitic. Nobody wants to hate Jews. Of course, if you're part of any tradition or value system, whether it's religiously Islam or Judaism or Christianity, I don't think there's any religion that actually advocates formal racism or hating on Jews generally. But it is something which we've become so scared of dealing with because of the Holocaust and the collective guilt that's been imposed on Europe because of all of that. It does immediately, and then because of the political apparatus and the media, the sensitivity around talking about Zionism and being able to separate it from Jewishness or the Jewish faith is extremely difficult. Are you labelled as anti-Semitic?
Well, of course, but look, the thing that we've got to find a way through this. It's ridiculous. I mean, yes, of course, people are intimidated into speaking out and against speaking out, and that's, of course, the objective of the Zionist strategy is to intimidate people and to make sure that they're bullied. And if they speak out, that they're sacked from their jobs or they can't continue to make the kinds of statements that, for example, that I've made. Now, I went through this case with my employer and I took them to a tribunal and I won. And I established in that tribunal that anti-Zionist views are worthy of respect in a democratic society, which is the language of the Equality Act, 2010. Now that itself has given thousands of people in this country confidence to say, actually, I'm an anti-Zionist, and to have more confidence in saying that, and to have more confidence in explaining what is the difference between Judaism, on the one hand, a religion, on the other hand, Zionism, which is a racist ideology. And that,
or Jewishness as an ethnic culture, ethno-cultural kind of phenomenon as well. That's a difference.
well, that's another question. But I think that the people need to have more confidence to make these kinds of arguments, and in order for that to happen, we need to speak about these things more, and we need to encourage people to have the confidence to speak about these issues.
Well, Professor David Miller, thank you so much. It's been a really tough sort of area to deal with, but countercultural, counterpolitical narratives invariably are going to be tough because the mainstream doesn't want to deal with these. And for me, the journey goes on. Quite clearly, I wouldn't condone anything, any ideology, be it disguised as a religious one or a secular one. If it was racist, if it discriminated with people deliberately, or supported oppression and tyranny anywhere. I don't think you would do that, quite frankly. And just because it happens to be a movement, a Zionist movement, which is attached to the word Jew or Jewishness, I don't think that we ought to be silenced. I don't think we should be censored. I don't think we should be afraid of dealing with that issue, because it's not about targeting a particular faith or a particular ethnicity. This is about a political movement, and it's very clear that a political movement is different from the core of any particular religion, and we need to treat it as such. So we've had an interesting journey in which it's quite clear that the Zionist movement has extraordinary influence, extraordinarily disproportionate influence, many would argue. Certainly in today's program, that's what's been argued. And that is potentially a threat not only to our own freedoms and our liberties. It's also a threat to our morality and our value system, whatever that may be in terms of a humanitarian outlook to the world. If it leads us to justify genocide, to justify governments which are terrorizing their own people, and if it leads to tyranny, murder, and of course, torture and all sorts of other abuse. And I think that's the question that is at stake. At what point do we silence ourselves on our fundamental values when it comes to facing perhaps a movement which is extraordinarily powerful, has a lot of financial clout, and can make life difficult for us on a day-to-day basis? At what point do we discard our duty to humanity and to truth and to justice? Thank you for watching this edition of Deep Dive Perspective. Do please hit that like, share and subscribe button so that we can produce more programs which help you to get to the truth of things.